Welcome again, everybody, to this year's symposium. We have 5 presentations in keeping with the tradition that started. They're going to be very short and focused presentations of up to 10 minutes each, followed by a short Q&A session. And then we're going to make time to have a plenary, a short plenary at the end of the afternoon, where there's an opportunity to explore any questions of common interest across the presentations. The other thing that I should say by way of introduction is that this symposium is an opportunity for all of our HDRs whose interest is not all within the remit of the TRA NSW symposium to present their work, and we endeavour to have this the 2 symposia taking place as close to each other as possible. And of special interest within ITLS, we do now have a new prize awarded for the first time last year, the Wendy and Christopher Adam Prize, and the prize goes to the best presentation by an ITLS student across the 2 symposia. So I think that is enough by way of housekeeping. Please encourage our colleagues joining us online to have themselves on mute. Our first speaker, Alicja, is joining us from overseas, speaking to us online. The remaining presentations are by colleagues who are here in the business school meeting room. Over to you, Alicja.
Thank you, John, and hello everyone. It's good to see you. Well, it's great to be able to share with you the second of the 3 research papers that for my thesis, and which we worked together and with great support of my supervisor Rico and associate supervisor Stefan Mesiek from SIE. So this research is set, sorry about that. This research is set in an airline context during the COVID-19 pandemic. And let's say in normal times, so times without global pandemic and border closures, the airline and aviation industry was characterized as complicated. So management in the airline context has been exposed to a myriad of challenges with characteristics such as cyclicality, high fixed cost structures, volatility, and reliance on externally provided factors, which all increase complexity and firm internal tensions over the right strategies, for example, related to risk management. Sorry about that. Moreover, the international character of airline operations, as well as the relatedness and connection to different business functions, make strategic management intricate. Moreover, value is created along the entire chain of carriers operations, starting from ground handling to maintenance. Business units and various tools are applied to facilitate these processes, including visual aids such as dashboards, which are used to assist in strategy implementation and to communicate with various stakeholders, such as suppliers. So COVID-19 pandemic has only added to that already challenging picture. The industry experienced the biggest shock in the history, which turned airline strategies on their head and tested resilience to the maximum, as well as redefined their operations for the future. And you can see on the screen the extreme impacts acknowledged by the newspapers, for example. And as shown on the bottom right, since COVID-19 hit airline markets in January 2020, there has been substantial volatility, and not only in demand when lockdowns or travel border restrictions grounded entire fleets, but also in operations, both in terms of grounding and ramping up capacity in fast fashion and sequencing. So we're talking about an airline, an organization which has to face volatile and quickly changing environment, frequent domestic border closures and openings and travel restrictions, massive workforce layoffs, and strategy being in flux and in survival mode. But at the same time, flying and being ready to ramp up whenever the opportunity to fly comes back but comes back in a new way. So with different requirements related to safety or health measures, for example. And it's not only about the airline itself, it's also about bringing its suppliers on that journey. So airports, ground handling providers, and ensuring that timely communication and coordination, as well as compliance with the new operating environment, which is much different to what anyone knew before, is ensured. So the final takeaway from that introduction is that it's very challenging to manage across different levels of organization, such as an airline, and to implement your strategy and manage performance from top to operational levels. And imagine doing that when a tornado is going through basically across it. So how do organizations like airlines, which require such tremendous work to coordinate and ensure implementation of strategies across levels, including also outside of their organizational boundaries, such as to supplier settings, do it? It's common to deploy visual management systems, which are derived from lean methodologies and Toyota production system. And these are deployed to communicate and drive behavior and performance improvements, as well as are crucial to linking corporate strategies with actions on operational level, supporting teams in meeting their business objectives. So in simple terms, we are looking at, we're talking about a visual KPI dashboards with colors, graphs, and visual management tools, which indicate performance as good or bad and drive change and improvements. And in this specific case, we consider visual performance management dashboard and KPIs developed by an airline to manage performance of its suppliers over 70 airports across Australia. And you can see a simplified example of such system in the right top corner. And there has been recognized increasing importance of KPIs for organizational accountability, as well as acknowledged shift to next generation KPIs. So KPIs which are more forward-looking and for which leadership will be deciding which ones will inform human behavior and which, for example, will inform machine learning. These kind of decisions will increasingly determine enterprise success. And it's also acknowledged that in the management literature that leading companies treat their KPIs not as simply as numbers to hit, but as tools of transformation and look to leading indicators to frame their strategies. At the same time, and as mentioned, airline operations are inherently related to stakeholder coordination, and management of relationships in aviation supply chain is associated with costs and risks. Moreover, in airline industry, such costs are being characterized as high due to associated transactions asset specificity, as well as frequency, uncertainty, and complexity. And while existing literature applied transaction cost economics, a perspective in aviation context, considering, for example, relationship and vertical coordination between airports and airlines, what mediates such relationships and how management of such relationships influence the level of transaction costs remain unknown. So taking from these two literature streams, we want to answer the question of how do innovative visuals help airline to maintain transaction cost-effective relationship with supplier, as well as manage suppliers, as well as manage performance in crisis. So we developed three hypotheses. Firstly, that KPI leadership alignment indicated by measures such as empowerment by the KPIs, satisfaction with them, and KPI strategy relevance have positive impact on such KPI perception and use. And that's measured by frequency of use or time spent using and analyzing the KPIs. Then H2, so the relationship, here we are looking at the relationship between the KPI deployment and use and the level of transaction costs proxied by measures of uncertainty, trust, conflicts, asset specificity, or complexity. So we were speculating that transaction costs are low due to the use of visual performance management systems. And finally, H3, we are looking at whether KPI perception and use, so how much the KPIs dashboards are used by the suppliers have impact on their actual performance. So we would expect naturally that higher usage of the KPI, of the visual KPIs, would improve performance outcomes of the suppliers or airport which supply services to the airline. So this is a mixed method study, and data collection for it lasted between September 2019 and March 2022. We performed a survey which contacted 50 regional airports that the airline deals with domestically, and which provide ramp handling and customer service functions to the airline. Survey period was between September 2021 until March 2022, with 3 waves of invites and reminders, with the majority of responses being recorded in December 2021. Sorry for a second. Sorry, I've been a little bit sick. Sorry. Can I maybe come back in a second?
Okay, take a moment. Yeah.
All right, sorry about that. So that was complemented with visits to the airline headquarters and observation of the airline employees using the visual performance system in situ, performing interviews, participating in the meetings as well. That included also online meeting participation and interviewing during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown periods. And in addition, field visits were undertaken to 2 ground handlers, which were defined as performing really well and not well enough to observe their operations and performance management and use of the visual management system, as well as to perform interviews. So we performed first stage analysis, testing for the 3 of the outlined hypotheses and making use of the qualitative data from field visits as well. So on to the findings. In the first stage, we investigated the relationship between KPI leadership alignment and KPI deployment. So we basically ran 3 random effects panel regression models, in which we tested the effects of the 3 variables on the left, and we discovered that the relevance has an impact on perceived KPI usefulness, frequency of the use, and time spent on the visuals. So we uncovered that perceived impact is an important factor. In the second stage, we looked into the effects of the visuals through the lens of transaction cost economics. And we analyzed transaction cost proxies for 35 airports, pre-COVID and post-COVID. Post-COVID and during the new normal, so environment which was volatile and defined by the restrictions and new operating requirements. So the overall results indicated that visuals result in low transaction costs at airline-supplier interface and get even lower during crisis, which is the opposite to what we would expect. And finally, in stage 3, we tested whether KPI perception and use have an impact on firm performance. So first of all, we found that the busier the airport is, the lower the performance was as well, so which is expected. In addition, the perceived KPI usefulness has impact on performance, which confirms that the system is working. In addition, during COVID, overall performance improved, mainly due to safety performance improvements. At last, and most surprising finding, the more time supplier or ground handler spent on the visual KPIs, the worse they performed. So puzzled with that outcome, we performed follow-up interviews as well as corroborated the data with the field visits in the airline headquarters and 2 ground handlers, one which was deemed as performing well and one that was performing not well enough. So indeed, during the field visits as well as interviews and observations, it became apparent that there existed a disjoint in the intended by the airline use of the system and its actual use by the supplier. So airline staff intended that the KPIs provided understanding of the processes to the suppliers and improve their business, including performance and strategy. Yet, while the airline managers engage in regular performance management and monitoring, which they deemed as beneficial to the process of the suppliers themselves did not really find a system of significant effectiveness. And that was confirmed both by the survey responses as well as the interviews during the suppliers' field visits. So both ground handlers which were visited expressed views on the system which indicated low level of engagement. So on one hand, we confirmed that visuals were perceived to be useful on average to some extent and resulting in lower transaction costs, especially during crisis. However, what we found was a phenomenon that we call proportional accountability. So reportedly, the ground handler teams get to see their performance scores prior to a monthly meeting with the airline. And if those scores are poor, they know that they need to do more research as they will be scrutinized. So hence they would invest more time into looking at the visuals and KPIs and preparing for the meeting. So we've confirmed it also through the follow-up post-survey interviews with airports and 2 in-depth case studies. So if there was no performance reviews, then they would not put in the required efforts. So as such, the system works. However, it is used in a reactive way and not as intended by the airline. So in a more strategic, proactive way, which is driving business improvements and which is strategically relevant. So what? So while we, this is my last slide. So while we know that visual performance management systems have effects in terms of keeping the transaction costs low and decrease them in crisis, in fact, as well as they themselves increase their importance in crisis, their effectiveness matters and has to be considered around a number of aspects, including the aspects of reactive and proactive management. And there can be a risk of discrepancy between the intention of the system and its perception by the user. And based on our research, this paper provides also outlook for the future opportunities related to visual management systems in the airline industry. And given the high complexity of the aviation operations and interconnectivity of the different business units and stakeholders, it is expected that the coordination of the different elements will only increase in importance, and including performance for performance management and strategy implementation in volatile and uncertain conditions. So that would be it from my side.
Okay, thank you very much, Alicia. Any questions? Maybe take one from the room and one from online. Online participants could use the raise hand function, but let me start in the room. Any questions?
They hear us properly.
Let's try. Can you hear us? Can you hear Benham speaking?
A little bit, not very detailed. It's a little bit of an echo.
Okay, the microphone is at the front.
Okay, I can hear you, John, but towards the back, it's a little bit of an echo.
Better here?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Well, thanks for the presentation. A couple of things from my side. Well, firstly, almost 70% of your slides I couldn't even read. There's so much. The font is very tiny. The choice of colors should be smarter to allow us to read from distance. Obviously, I mean, even from distance, this was quite not easy to read. Now, a couple of questions for you in terms of your research. So one thing is your hypothesis development. Your hypothesis seems to be very general and not specifically related to airline industry. So when you position your hypothesis, I was wondering if you are researching the literature beyond airline industry or it's specific to airline. And if it is specific to airline, then you need to be specific in your hypothesis development. So the wording of your hypothesis must be in a way that makes it specific to that industry. Because currently, if you look at your hypothesis one, it's a very generic kind of statement. And if you can prove that in every context, that would be a big question already. right? So you can't really necessarily generalize things. The other thing was your data collection, that slide that you have on your methodology, it doesn't tell us much about data collection. So we don't know how you collected the data. So survey participants, for example, what sort of sample size, and who were the participants, how did you validate the results? And then the cases study, how did you collect the data, where the data came from, and what sort of process you had in mind, what sort of challenges. So data collection itself in survey and case studies is a big chunk of your methodology. So you're going to be extra careful about the details that you provide about data. I think for now, I've got a few other things as well, but they're rather minor. So yeah, that's for now.
Okay. I guess so. For it's beyond aviation. Actually, I think especially our first hypothesis, it was based on the management report from MIT about kind of the next generation KPIs and what are the problems across the industries with management in general of KPIs and development and alignment. And in terms of, so that's like, if I can respond in any way, but yeah, thank you for the comments, especially I think about the data collection that can be more clear, how we validated the data as well, and what was there. I think maybe I didn't mention that we had a sample of 35 airports, so that these were the ground handlers that we targeted our survey at. But yeah, thank you for the comments.